Last time we pulled a vacuum using 2 vacuum hoses and 3 valve core removal tools. Now we're going to drop it down to 1 single vacuum hose and 2 core removal tools. We're still going to need our nitrogen tank, which we need anyways if we're brazing or pressure testing. We have a refrigerant tank and our scale. We have of course our vacuum pump and our optional but really great to have tank heater. Just like we did before, we need to start with our bench test or blank off test for our vacuum pump. So let's start there. Hint, I never actually changed the vacuum pump oil from last time. So let's see if that oil is still good. Valve core tool is connected. I'm going to put a cap on the end, which I shouldn't need because this is a vacuum rated valve, but just in case we'll put that cap on. Now I can put my micron gauge right here on the end. We'll power up our micron gauge. And just like before, our micron gauge is on this side of that valve. So once we turn this pump on, we'll be able to see how good our oil is and have the condition of our pump and also be able to check our micron gauge. We can see we pulled our microns down to 40 microns. That wasn't as deep as we had it the first time when we had virgin clean vacuum pump oil. However, we still pulled on below 50 microns, so I'm going to continue to use this same exact vacuum pump oil. It's the same exact day. We haven't lost anything other than just a couple hours of time. So we're going to run with that. Next thing we do is let's go ahead and set up for our vacuum. And just like before, we want to check these caps. Now before, I already put the nylog on the cap, so I don't have to worry about sealing that again. You can see how the valve is pulled all the way up. It's completely open and it's almost flush with the top. So we are pulling a vacuum through the entire line. So you either want this to be all the way open or all the way closed. In a pump down situation, that valve is going to be closed all the way down, and it's going to separate the compressor side from the side that we're pulling a vacuum on. So this service port here is going to be connected to this side of the hose, and if this valve was closed, everything on that side would be separate. Now if you're going to pull a vacuum from a pump down, you got to think also about these valves. If somebody overheated the valve like they did here, it's unlikely that this valve is going to seat or close properly when you pull it all the way shut. So it's possible you won't get down to a deep vacuum when you're pulling a vacuum from a pump down system. We have the same thing here. We make sure that this valve is all the way up. It's almost flush with the top, which is what we want. We can see the corrosion from before. We can't help that. But also put the nylog in here already from last time. And since the cap's all the way up, we're pulling all the way from the entire system. And again, if it was pumped down, this valve would be closed all the way down. Their service port would be reading on this side of the line. Make sure the cap is on there all the way. And make sure it's good and tight, because as we pull a vacuum, just like before, if we pull a vacuum with that cap off, it's going to be pulling in atmospheric pressure. I already have the valve core removed from this side. What I'm going to do different is I'm actually going to install the valve core on the liquid side. So we're going to put our valve core in right here. Now we have the valve core on this side, not on this side. And just like before, we're going to put our valve core tool on the suction side with no valve core in, just a little drop of nylog around there. Put the valve core removal tool in. Make sure I can open and close this valve. We're in good shape. I do not have a valve core in this side port, which is how I want it to be. I'm going to take my second valve core tool, I'm going to put it right here on the side. Little drop of nylog, take my micron gauge, I'm going to put it right here on this very end. For this example, I'm going to add an extra extension on so we can see it in the camera. So this is the adapter that I'm going to be using. I already have my nylog still on there, so I don't need to reapply. Just going to add my little adapter. Since I have 2 female connections, they won't hook together, so I'm going to use this adapter. In field service, I wouldn't do these extra steps because, again, the more connections we have, the more likely we are to have fail points or leaks, so I want to make sure the fewest connections as possible, but for this video demonstration, we'll use it. Like we did before, we're going to have our vacuum hose or large vacuum hose. I have the plug here for the large side. And also on the small side, I have just this little adapter. Since I don't have the 2 hoses connect together, I just have something I can put in here to keep it dry. Now in this case, I use an automatic low loss fitting, but you could use an old pressure sensor in there or anything that can just plug that hole. They also make little caps for that. But this is the 1/4 inch side. We're going to put the 1/4 inch side right on the very end of the suction. Other side of our hose, we have our 3/8 connector. I'm going to take the plug out. And we're going to thread that right onto the 3/8 connector that comes with our vacuum. With the design of this pump, I cannot get my hose to attach properly. Notice at the angle that this is at. So I'm not able to use it without an adapter. So what I'm going to use is the T that I used before. I'm just going to leave the cap of my T on the back side. We take the front side of the cap off, and we can attach our hose right there. Just put a little drop of nylon. So with my vacuum hose hooked up, we still have something else to do. We have to purge our nitrogen through. So this is where I'm going to use my other hose. Again, this is the hose I use only for vacuum or nitrogen. So this hose is clean and clear. It's never had any kind of oil in it. The side that has my manual valve, this is what I'm going to install right here at my liquid line. So it does have the valve core depressor, and we do have the valve core located right here. So I'm going to thread this on the high side. Just going to leave this little manual valve right here, leave it in the open position, in line with the hose. The other end of this hose, we're going to attach over here to our nitrogen tank, to our flow regulator. So our nitrogen tank is connected to our nitrogen regulator, which is connected to our flow regulator, which is connected to our 1/4 inch hose with the valve on it. From there, it's connected to our valve core, automatic valve core, which is connected into the liquid line. So when I open this up, nitrogen is going to flow through this hose, through that valve core, all the way through the liquid line, through the metering device, through the evaporator coil. It's going to come back to the suction side. It's going to continue to flow through this vacuum hose. I have the vacuum open on the bottom side and it's closed at the top side. This prevents pushing any air or moisture up into my micron gauge. It keeps it separate. So again, the micron gauge valve is closed off, but the valve is open for this large hose. So as I force nitrogen through, nitrogen is going to come through this hose to this connector right here, and then I have the cap off on this end. So it's going to free flow right out of this opening instead of it going into my vacuum pump. Just a very small amount of pressure. I really just want to flow nitrogen through the system to push out as much moisture as I can. So the first time I pulled a vacuum in the system, that method had the card stacked against it because this system had been left open from the valves all the way to this side for over a month. So now we're doing it with, we'd recently pulled a vacuum. So this should be a lot faster. However, I did leave both of these open for about 2 hours to try to make up the difference. So there would be some moisture in there to make all of this relevant. But we'll see what happens. So now I'm going to make sure my nitrogen regulator is backed off. I'm going to open my nitrogen tank. This side is going to read the pressure in the tank. This side is going to read the pressure going down to my flow indicator. I should be using such a small amount, I shouldn't even see it reading right here, but we should be able to see it reading with this little ball right here. So I'm going to close this down ever so slightly, just nice and slow, close this down. And here, and we can see this ball pushed up on the top side. So now we know that we have pressure pushing nitrogen through the liquid line, through the metering device, through the evaporator. It's coming all the way back to the suction line. It's flowing through this valve right here, through the big hose, and it's leaking or purging out right here. And it's a very small amount of pressure. I'm going to increase the pressure so we can hear it. But I really don't want that much pressure flowing through, so I'm going to back this off. On the flow regulator side, I'm going to adjust this knob. That's going to adjust the little ball in here, which really just represents how fast we're flowing. So just a little bit above the middle. This allows me to just barely flow some nitrogen through here. All I'm trying to do is push out any moisture that's in that system. It's just barely flowing through here. That's going to speed up my vacuum, and it's going to make my oil last longer because I'm not pushing all that moisture into it. Now, while this is flowing nitrogen, we're going to hook up our tank heater. Now our tank heater is installed. There's a thermostat on this tank heater that keeps it from getting too hot, and all we have to do is plug this in. Now if my compressor came with a crankcase heater, I wouldn't need to use my tank heater. However, I still like to use a tank heater because it's quick, it's fast, and even though it's designed to heat tanks, it does really well to heat the bottom of the compressor. Now a lot of people don't have these tank heaters to use, and that's okay. You can still use a heat gun, or a lot of people just do it without. Especially when the temperature is colder though, you want to make sure you heat this oil up. Now it's not going to make any difference at all while we're flowing nitrogen because nitrogen can't flow through the compressor because of the valves. All we're trying to do is help speed this up while we're pulling a vacuum. The reason I'm doing it right now, because while I'm waiting for that nitrogen to flow, I go ahead and hook this up, get it plugged in, and it just saves me a little bit of time. Now, depending on who you talk to, there's different ideas of how long you should flow nitrogen. This is a fairly small system, so I'm just flowing it through for a couple of minutes or so. Now, if it's a contaminated, heavily contaminated system, or it had been raining or snowing or something like that, and I know there's a good chance of contaminants, I'll run it for much longer. I just simply flowing it through. Again, I do not want to put pressure inside of that system. If I put too much pressure, it can actually cause the water vapor to condense back into a liquid back on these surfaces. So by keeping it in the vapor form and just smoothly flowing out helps. Next thing I'm going to do is put this cap on, and I'm going to close off the suction valve to my vacuum hose. Now I'm adding a little bit of pressure. I don't want too much, maybe about a pound or so. So I'm just going to add just a little bit of pressure in here just to add some positive pressure in that system. And I'm going to close off my nitrogen tank because I'm not going to need that. And I'm going to close off the little valve right here on this tank hose. There's just a little bit of positive pressure in the system. So I'm going to take my hose loose here. We hear the nitrogen come out of the hose, but we also hear the nitrogen slowly bleed out of both regulators till it equals back out. Next thing I'm going to do is get my refrigerant tank ready. So I'm going to take and connect this hose to my refrigerant tank. And in this case, I'm just going to open this valve a little bit to allow some of that pressure to flow back through this hose to make sure it stays clean. And while that's purging, I just simply tighten that up. I turn my tank upside down. I take my scale, I go ahead and turn my scale on, and I zero or tear the scale out so that it's reading everything on here is 0. Then I'm going to turn my scale back off because I'm not ready for it right now, but it's going to be ready when I'm ready for it. So now we have purged the system. And again, with this method, we're not able to purge through the condenser, but that's okay. We purge through a lot of the system. It just takes a couple of minutes to do that. I have a little bit of pressure built up in here, so what we're going to do is go ahead and open this valve, and we'll make sure that all of that pressure comes out. Hear how the pressure is dropping? Now that the pressure's dropped, I've put this cap back on, and we know that we have nitrogen in the system, no moisture, no pressure. I'm also going to open up the valve to my micron gauge. So the valve is open to my micron gauge, open to my large vacuum hose, and I'm also open all the way to my tank. So everything's open, 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 open. It's all open. We're ready to now pull our vacuum. The caps are on, everything's tight, we have nylon on all of our connections. We're going to loosen the gas ballast, and then we're going to start the vacuum up. We get down to about 20,000 microns, we're going to close this gas ballast. Last time it happened so fast we blew past that stop, but it's okay, we'll get started. So you can see over here we blew past our stop point. We're already below 800 microns. So I'm going to go ahead and close my gas ballast, but really you should close it beforehand. With this fast vacuum setup, we're able to pull that vacuum down much faster. And you didn't see too much smoke going on here, but a lot of times there's a lot of water vapor. That water vapor will be coming out of the pump, and you'll see what it looks like smoke, but it's typically water vapor. So we're below 700 microns. This is a great time to do a preliminary leak test. What we can do is then close off our suction valve right here. So all this vacuum hose is completely isolated. And then we can see how fast our microns are jumping up. Now we can see our microns are rising. Let's see what it levels off at. So notice that we jumped up to 877 microns, and it's still going up, but very slowly. This tells us that we're unlikely to have a leak. If I had a leak in the system, it would be going up non-stop. So the reason it jumps back up is because we still have water vapor in there, we still have water evaporating, moisture evaporating, even possible refrigerant evaporating that's in that oil. So now that we've done that test, we can open this valve back up again. So now that with this valve open, we're then pulling a vacuum from the system, and we see our microns again start to drop. So we're going to go down below 500 microns, and then once we get down there, we're going to do another blank off test. So we've pulled down to 357, 356 microns, but it took us a lot longer. It took us 30 minutes to get to this point, but we are down low enough. Our next step is going to do our decay test. So for a decay test, I'm simply going to close off this one valve right here, and that's going to separate the vacuum hose and vacuum pump from the system. So this hose is still hooked up to our tank, so I can shut this valve or leave it on. It's not really going to matter. I do leave this valve on to my micron gauge, so I'm reading what's in the system. So the microns will go up, but they should level off. If it goes up to a high level, say 1,000 microns, and then levels off, then we know we got moisture in the system. And if it goes up non-stop, then we know for sure that we have a leak in that system. So we're just going to give it about 15 minutes or so and see how high we go. Every manufacturer is different for what they want. Follow their specifications. Now that we are in our decay test and have this valve shut off, I can shut off my vacuum pump. So after our decay test, our vacuum test, our blank off test, we did hit 500 microns after 15 minutes. Either way, we're going to continue with our example. I already have the hose closed off to the vacuum pump and the vacuum pump's off. The next thing I'm going to do is close off the valve to my micron gauge. This isolates my micron gauge so that it doesn't have any damage. And what I can do next, I can actually take my micron gauge off so it's out of the way. Atmospheric pressure comes back into it, it goes to OL. And if I wanted, I could also take loose this vacuum hose because we don't need it right now. Then my vacuum hose, I got this large opening. I'm going to put the plug back in so I keep it clean, dry, and tight. There's the other side, I'm just going to put a little plug in here as well. This is going to keep it nice and clean and dry. You can also put in a connector and you can pull the vacuum on your hose if you wanted, or put nitrogen or purge nitrogen through this individual hose if you wanted. It is an option. Now that we're done with our vacuum pump, we're done with our vacuum hose, we're done with our micron gauge, we're ready to charge the system. Next is close off this valve to my tank. I'm going to turn on my refrigerant scale and then I'm going to open up this tank. So we have liquid refrigerant flowing into this hose. It says that there's 3 ounces of liquid refrigerant in this hose and ready to charge the system. Now I've already pulled a vacuum through this hose so it's clean, dry, and tight, and now there's nothing but pure refrigerant in it. And this hose is still protected because there's pressure in the tank of refrigerant. There's now refrigerant in this hose, but there's no oil in this hose because there's no oil in this tank. And the pressure in the hose is going to be greater than the pressure in the line because we are below atmospheric pressure. So I'm going to just open this valve and lets liquid refrigerant flow directly into the liquid line. That liquid refrigerant flows in both directions, flows through the metering device to the evaporator, boiling from a liquid to vapor, and in this case it's also flowing into the condenser, boiling from a liquid to vapor. As that liquid refrigerant boils into a vapor, we end up getting vapor pressure on both the high and the low side. The difference is I only have vapor on the high side, and on the low side, when I get done, I'm still going to have pure liquid refrigerant. We never want to do this step on the suction side with the system off because all that liquid refrigerant will fill up this line, it will fill up in that compressor, and when that compressor starts up, bam, we're going to have a dead compressor. So we want to make sure that we only put liquid in through the liquid side when the system is off. So now that I have positive pressure in my system, we can put these valve cores back in. My valve core here is on the end of this tool. I'm going to slide it up inside of this component, put the little end cap on it. Now when I open this valve, positive pressure is going to push back this direction. Now I can overcome the positive pressure with my thumb, I can push it in, and then I can thread that valve core back into place. So I'm going to close this valve off, and I'm going to loosen this end. And just to make sure that we have it correct, I'm going to slowly open this to make sure no refrigerant came out. So when this is open, no refrigerant came out, so we know that that valve core is doing its job. We can now take this tool off. Now our valve core is in here, and we also still have our valve core in on this side as well. I can now take off this, and because there's a valve core in here, I can take this off without any problem. Just a de minimis amount, just from what was between this part of my hose. Valve core is in, our vacuum is done. Now I do have my tank heater on that compressor acting as a crankcase heater. I do want to take that off before I start that system up. But we take that out, the system is ready to be started up, ready to run, and we can top it off with superheat and subcooling from there, and our system is ready to go. So we can take our vacuum pump, put it back in the truck, take our nitrogen tank, put it back in the truck, put our hoses, micron gauge. We want to make sure we keep all this clean and dry. Make sure it's in some kind of protective container so it doesn't get dirty or wet or anything like that, so it's in as great a shape as possible. Now that we've taken all of our vacuum system off, we can now hook up our probes or our gauges or whichever method you prefer, and then we still have refrigerant inside this hose. From there, if I'm using probes, I put the T on, and I can use this little valve to continue charging it after the system is running, throttling it in, small amounts of refrigerant into the suction side, giving it time to boil into a vapor before it hits the compressor, or I can hook this onto the middle port of a traditional manifold manifold gauge set, and I can throttle it into the suction. Little bitty shots of refrigerant in there, allowing it to turn into a vapor before it gets to that vapor pump. Before I get completely charged, I would then take my tank and turn this valve off, and then I can bleed that last little bit of liquid refrigerant out of this hose, only have vapor refrigerant left. From there, I can take this hose off, put my little adapter between it, connect my hose together, and make sure I keep this hose oil-free, because I'm only going to be using it for vacuum and nitrogen. Even though we ran refrigerant to this hose, refrigerant's flowing into the system, so we never had oil in this hose, and that's the key to that. The refrigerant's not going to hurt it. It is the oil that we're worried about. From there, our vacuum is done. We did the vacuum test. We did all the steps. Stay tuned. We're going to be doing some other examples with different types of vacuum, and let's see how that works.